As we walked into the school event together, I heard a sharp voice cut through the air. "You both came together. Does that mean you're both unemployed?" The leader-like tone of Miss Brown made my skin crawl. She was looking down on us, questioning our presence at the event. Instead of focusing on the event itself, she was determined to assert her superiority. The event was meant to be about the children reading their essays about their parents' jobs, yet Miss Brown chose to criticize us in front of the kids. Her words hung in the air, and I could feel the sting of judgment. The children began taking turns reading their essays, each one about their parents' careers. The excitement in the room was palpable as they spoke proudly of their families. Finally, it was our son Christopher's turn. I couldn't help but hold my breath. "My dad's job is..." The classroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Christopher read aloud, but Patricia, one of the parents in the front row, turned bright red. Her eyes darted down to the floor, avoiding all eye contact. I smiled as Christopher read on, his voice steady and clear. This was his moment, and I couldn't have been prouder. But as I looked around the room, I could feel the eyes on us, eyes that were judging, sizing us up. I glanced at the other parents and teachers, some of whom looked almost too eager to hear what Christopher would say next. "My name is Sharon Williams, a 34-year-old housewife. Recently, I made the big decision to move to New York City with my husband, Jose, due to his job transfer. It's been a challenging transition for our family, but we're making it work. Our son, Christopher, is now in 3rd grade, and we're trying to settle into our new routine. I feel a deep sense of guilt about Christopher having to change schools at such a sensitive age. Moving can be difficult, especially for children, but Christopher has taken it in stride. He's so adaptable, and I'm grateful for that." After unpacking and getting settled, I told Jose and Christopher to stay home while I went to school to complete the final steps of Christopher's transfer paperwork. It felt like the beginning of something new, an unfamiliar chapter in our lives. When I arrived at the school gate, I was greeted by the cheerful voices of children waving goodbye to their parents. The teachers smiled warmly at the students, making me feel a bit more comfortable as I approached the school entrance. I explained the situation to one of the teachers at the front desk, and she kindly guided me to the staff room. As I rounded the corner, I heard raised voices. A tense argument was unfolding just outside the staff room door. "Why don't you understand?" one voice snapped. "I'm advising for the good of the school. Do you think my advice is wrong?" I froze in place, my curiosity piqued. As I glanced around, I could see the frustration on the faces of the teachers and parents involved. The students who had gathered in the hallway were starting to look uncomfortable. Their eyes darted nervously from one side to the other. As I stood there, observing the scene unfold, I could sense a growing tension in the air. The voices of the arguing adults were harsh and abrasive, cutting through the otherwise calm atmosphere of the school. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. You knew something was going to happen, but you couldn't look away. Some of the teachers seemed agitated, trying to defuse the situation, while others were more passive, avoiding getting involved. The conversation was getting louder by the second, making me uncomfortable. I quickly looked for an exit, hoping to get out of the tension-filled atmosphere. As I walked away from the scene, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange encounter I had just witnessed. Why was there so much animosity among the parents and teachers? What were they arguing about? The confusion lingered in my mind as I made my way to the staff room. Little did I know, this would be the first of many surprises to come in our new life in New York City. "You know, each family has their own circumstances," one of the parents said with an air of superiority. "But it's impossible for everyone to meet your standards," another parent chimed in, her voice cutting through the tension. "Then those families should move to another area. Especially you over there," she said, pointing a finger at someone in the crowd. "You need to move for the sake of the school." The exchange grew more heated. The words stung, but I could barely focus on them as I stood at the back of the argument, trying to stay out of the line of fire. "What did we ever do?" a voice asked, pleading for the situation to calm down. "Everyone calm down. Let's change places and discuss this." I couldn't stay silent any longer. With a quiet but firm voice, I spoke up. "Excuse me, I'm here to transfer my son," I said, trying to cut through the chaos. Could you let me through? At my words, the arguing parents and teachers all turned to look at me. A few of them paused in their heated exchange, their eyes shifting toward me as I stood at the edge of the scene. One of the parents, realizing I was waiting to pass through, apologized and moved aside. A teacher, equally apologetic, said, "Sorry for the trouble. Let's change places and discuss this." As I made my way into the staff room, I couldn't help but notice one particular parent, dressed in bold, flamboyant clothes. She was heavily made up, with her gaze sharp and appraising. I felt her eyes on me as I walked past. It was impossible to ignore her scrutiny. Unable to bear it any longer, I hesitantly turned toward her and asked, "Is there something on me?" She scoffed, a dismissive smile playing on her lips. "What are you wearing?" she asked in a tone that oozed condescension. "Really, I'm tired of seeing so many shabby people." With a derisive snort, she turned on her heel and walked away. I stood there in stunned silence, watching her leave. The words stung, but the shock was what kept me rooted to the spot. How could anyone be so judgmental, especially in a place like this? As I collected myself, the teacher who had been guiding me spoke up. "I'm very sorry for the disturbance," she said softly, sensing my discomfort. "How can I help you today?" I took a deep breath and forced a polite smile. "I'm Sharon Williams," I introduced myself, trying to shake off the negative energy from the encounter. "I'm here to complete the transfer process for my son, Christopher." The teacher nodded with understanding and quickly shifted her focus to helping me with the paperwork. The earlier tension seemed to fade as we got down to business, and I found myself relieved to finally be moving past the drama. "I'm Sharon Williams," I introduced myself, feeling a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. "I'm here to complete my son's transfer procedures." The teacher behind the desk nodded. "I see. We can handle that here. Please come in." I stepped into the staff room, still processing the chaotic scene outside. But before I could fully relax, the teacher's expression shifted slightly, as if something was bothering her. "Who was that person just now?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. One of the other parents, still visibly upset from the earlier argument, responded in a hushed tone, "That woman is Miss Brown. She's the PTA president here. You could say she's a self-appointed leader. Her husband's a CEO, and she's an executive herself, so she tends to flaunt her status around the school. It's really troubling, to be honest." I felt a knot form in my stomach. Just earlier, she told me and my daughter that we looked poor and should move to another neighborhood. "She's so full of herself just because she's wealthy," the parent continued, frustration evident in her voice. I couldn't believe it. "Is that so?" "Yes," she said, nodding. "Since you're here to register, you must have just moved in, right? Be careful with Miss Brown. Once she sets her sights on you, she can be a real nuisance." Other parents nearby, along with a few teachers, nodded in agreement. It seemed they all knew the same thing about her. She was not well-liked. "From what I've heard, Miss Brown has a habit of insulting housewives, calling them unemployed," one parent added. "When she meets you on the weekends, she shows off her expensive bags and accessories, always asserting her superiority." It seems she's disliked by both the teachers and the parents here. The more I heard, the more uneasy I became. It sounded like navigating life at this school would be more difficult than I had anticipated. Sighing, I left the school feeling both relieved and unsettled. It had been a month since Christopher had transferred to his new school in New York City, and I couldn't help but reflect on how difficult it would be to deal with the other parents, especially Miss Brown. But as I thought about Christopher's adjustment, I couldn't help but smile. He hadn't faced any bullying from his classmates and seemed to go to school happily every day. When he came home, he would excitedly share stories with Jose and me. "X and I played today," he would exclaim. "I got praised by the teacher today." His eyes would light up as he recounted every little detail of his day. I was relieved to see Christopher so happy. It was a sign that, despite the challenges, he was settling in well. One evening, after dinner, Christopher handed us a piece of paper with a serious look on his face. "What's this?" I asked, taking the paper from him. It's an invitation to a class visit, he explained, his voice tinged with excitement. We're supposed to write and read an essay about our parents' jobs, and I'd like Dad to come too. Not just Mom. His words caught me off guard. I looked at Jose, who was already checking his schedule on his smartphone. There was a brief moment of hesitation before Christopher's eyes widened in anticipation. Jose smiled and looked up at him. Looks like I have the day off, Christopher. I'll come to the class visit too. Christopher's face lit up with joy, and for a moment, everything felt right. It was a small, simple moment, but one that meant the world to him. Really? Yay. Christopher jumped up and down with joy, his excitement bubbling over. He was adorable, and it made my heart swell to see him so happy. Christopher, honey, I gently reminded him, don't jump around. You'll disturb the neighbors downstairs. Christopher, still grinning from ear to ear, tried his best to calm down. His energy was infectious, and I couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. One weekday, while Christopher was at school, Jose and I went grocery shopping at a nearby supermarket. As we parked our bikes outside, a taxi pulled up right in front of us. Out stepped Miss Brown, wearing clothes far too flashy for a simple grocery run. She caught sight of me and immediately approached, her expression displeased. I considered ignoring her and just walking away, but before I could act, Jose greeted her. I felt a bit trapped and had to engage. Hey, I saw you at school, didn't I? She asked, her tone dripping with disapproval. If I'm not mistaken, it was for the transfer registration. Hello, Miss Brown. I'm Sharon Williams, and this is my husband, Jose. Jose, nice to meet you, Jose said, extending a hand. After we introduced ourselves, Miss Brown gave us a once-over, sizing us up with an arrogant gaze. She then pointed to our bikes. Wait, she said with a sneer. Are you guys so poor that you can't even afford a car? Before Jose could respond, she cut him off and turned to me. Must be nice being a jobless wife, living off your husband, she added, her voice dripping with condescension. Jose looked at me, surprised by her rudeness. I shook my head, signaling for him to stay calm, and turned back to Miss Brown. We'll be going now, I said firmly, trying to end the interaction. But Miss Brown wasn't done. She stopped us, blocking our path. Sharon, you just moved here, so you probably don't know this, but we have a rule, she said, her voice laced with arrogance. You should listen to the whole story. It was all I could do to stop myself from reacting out loud. Her attitude was suffocating. Jose stood beside me, visibly displeased, while Miss Brown began showing off her flashy bags and accessories. Her gaze looked down at us, her words cutting like a knife. Everything you're wearing is cheap, she sneered. I can't believe you go out in such cheap clothes. No wonder you can't even afford a car. Her words felt like a slap in the face. Who do you think you are? I asked, finally losing my patience. You've been looking down on us since earlier. Watch your mouth. Honestly, Miss Brown continued, her voice dripping with disdain. I can't stand poor people. Your lack of manners is appalling. Stay away from me. I don't want to catch your poverty. It was ironic, considering she had approached us first. Did you say something? Miss Brown asked, clearly expecting me to cower. No, nothing, I said, my voice tight with anger. Even after that, Miss Brown continued flaunting her wealth, showing off her flashy accessories and looking down on us. I listened, feeling inwardly disgusted by her vulgarity. Satisfied, she smirked and said, make sure to dress better for the parent-teacher conference next week. I won't be responsible if you embarrass yourself. And with that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking loudly on the pavement. As we watched Miss Brown leave, Jose sighed heavily, shaking his head. What's with that woman? He muttered. And she's raising a kid? Her husband's a CEO, and she's the PTA president. I just don't get it. I hope her kid isn't bullying Christopher, I said, my mind immediately going to our son. Jose looked thoughtful. From what I can see, it doesn't seem like it. We both sighed, and then went about our shopping. As we strolled through the aisles, a thought lingered in my mind. Maybe Christopher is just pretending to be cheerful, so we wouldn't worry about him. The worry I felt never seemed to go away. At Jose's suggestion, we decided to pick up Christopher from school that day. When we arrived at the school gate, we saw him walking towards us, chatting happily with his new friends. His face lit up when he spotted us. "That's my mom and dad," he called out, proudly introducing us to his friends. After a brief conversation, he waved goodbye to his friends. "See you tomorrow," he said with a smile before running toward us. As we stood quietly, observing the other parents, I couldn't help but notice the subtle but palpable tension in the room. Some of the mothers shot Miss Brown looks of disdain, while others avoided eye contact altogether. A few of them whispered amongst themselves, clearly sharing their own unspoken opinions. It was evident that Miss Brown was not a favorite among the parents here. Jose and I remained silent, not wanting to engage with Miss Brown any further. We positioned ourselves in a way that allowed us to keep an eye on Christopher. I tried to figure out which child belonged to Miss Brown, but she was sitting next to us, and I couldn't pinpoint which child was hers. It wasn't until I noticed a boy sitting near Christopher's seat that I made the connection. He looked like he might be Miss Brown's son. While I was still observing the children, the bell signaling the start of class rang, and the students quickly took their seats. The children placed 2 sheets of writing paper on their desks, eagerly waiting for the teacher to begin. I couldn't help but admire how well-behaved they were, even at such a young age. But then, I overheard Miss Brown's voice, clearly displeased. "That kid's clothes look so shabby," she muttered, barely concealing her disdain. "What kind of upbringing makes someone think that ridiculous hairstyle is acceptable?" Her words were filled with venom, and I could see her fidgeting in discomfort, worried that the children might overhear her cruel commentary. As she continued to grumble, I noticed a boy sitting 2 seats behind Christopher, his head bowed low in embarrassment. He was dressed in expensive clothes, but his shoulders were hunched, perhaps due to nervousness. I felt a pang of sympathy for him. It was obvious that he was feeling the weight of Miss Brown's harsh words, and I couldn't help but wonder if this boy was, indeed, Miss Brown's child. My suspicions were confirmed when I noticed the boy's reaction to his mother's harsh remarks. His shoulders slumped even further when she addressed him, as though he was trying to shrink into the chair, hoping to escape the scrutiny. It was heartbreaking to witness. This child, who had everything material, seemed to be burdened by his mother's judgmental and demanding nature. I couldn't help but feel a mixture of sadness and frustration. This child, who should have been allowed to feel at ease, was instead under the crushing weight of his mother's expectations. The contrast between Miss Brown's arrogance and her son's shrinking form struck me deeply. As I was lost in these thoughts, the door suddenly opened, and the teacher entered the room. With a warm smile, the teacher addressed the class. "Now, children, I know many of you might be feeling nervous, but let's take a deep breath together to calm down," the teacher said. The children, eager to follow along, began to do the deep breathing exercises. At first, the breathing was steady and calm, but then the teacher held his breath without exhaling, and the children burst into laughter. I glanced over at Miss Brown's son, who had been tense and uncomfortable just moments ago. Now, his face brightened with laughter, and for the first time, I saw a glimpse of relief in his expression. It was as if, for that brief moment, he was free from the pressure his mother put on him. As the children laughed and joined in the fun with the teacher's light-hearted exercises, the atmosphere shifted. The nervous tension from before had melted away, and the class was filled with the pure joy of laughter. Even Miss Brown's son, who had been so tense earlier, couldn't help but laugh along with the other kids. The teacher, it seemed, had a fantastic sense of humor, and his playful energy had succeeded in easing the children's nerves. "All right, let's proceed in order," the teacher announced, his voice calm but enthusiastic. "Dorothy, you go first." One by one, the children stood up and began reading their essays. For 3rd graders, I was incredibly impressed by the quality of their work. I couldn't help but reminisce about my own elementary school days, where my essays were nowhere near as well-crafted as theirs. Then, it was finally Christopher's turn. He flashed us a big, bright smile, his excitement almost contagious. Standing in front of the class, he began reading his essay aloud. "My dad is a pilot. He flies planes all over the world. My mom used to work as a flight attendant, but now she stays home and cooks delicious meals for us. As he read, the classroom buzzed with excitement. Despite the teacher's efforts to quiet them, the children couldn't hold back their enthusiasm. "Wow, Christopher's dad is so cool," they exclaimed. Indeed, just as Christopher had written, Jose was an international pilot, and I had once worked as a flight attendant before stepping into my current role as a homemaker. Christopher continued, "Last month, we moved from Barcelona to New York. I can only speak Spanish, but Dad and Mom can speak many languages, so they can make the passengers on the plane smile." "Can you speak other languages, Christopher's dad and Mom? Say something." The teacher intervened, prompting us to share a few words in different languages. Jose and I took turns greeting the class in Spanish, French, German, Korean, and Chinese. The children applauded us, and I could feel a wave of pride for Christopher swelling inside me. Mom and Dad stay fit by riding bikes instead of driving a car. Thanks to that, Dad and Mom never catch colds and are really strong, Christopher continued. As I glanced over at Miss Brown, I noticed her face had turned bright red, and she was looking down, clearly embarrassed. Last week, she had mocked us for riding bikes instead of owning a car, and now, she was regretting her comments. Mom stays home, cooking meals and cleaning the house for me and Dad. She keeps everything tidy, Christopher finished. I love Dad for flying planes, and I love Mom for keeping our home nice and clean. The classroom erupted into applause, and Christopher gave a shy but proud smile as he sat down. I could see his joy reflected in his eyes, and Jose gave him a thumbs up. When I mouthed "great job" to him, Christopher beamed with happiness. As other children took their turns reading their essays, it was Miss Brown's son, Liam's, turn to present. His essay was filled with complex vocabulary, and he stumbled over several words, his discomfort apparent. It was clear to me that his mother had heavily influenced his essay, possibly even writing much of it herself. As the teacher kept a watchful eye on Liam, Miss Brown quietly slipped out of the classroom, likely to avoid any further scrutiny. When all the children had finished reading their essays, the teacher instructed them to post their work on the classroom wall. I stayed behind for a moment and left Christopher with Jose while I approached Liam. I knew it was probably out of self-satisfaction, but I couldn't help but offer a few comforting words to Liam. "You did great," I said gently. Liam thanked me quietly, his face still downcast. I could sense that his internal struggle was far from over. Later, I heard from some of the other mothers that Miss Brown had resigned from her position as PTA president and had stopped attending school events altogether. Her absence seemed to bring relief to both teachers and parents. But I couldn't share in their joy. While it might have been a weight lifted for the adults, I felt sorry for her child, Liam. When I asked Christopher about Liam, he said that Liam seemed a little down lately. Sensing my concern for him, Christopher invited Liam over to our house one weekend. The two of them found common ground quickly and started to bond over their shared interests. As they spent more time together, Liam's smile slowly began to return. Christopher was overjoyed to have made a best friend. He eagerly counted down the days until the weekend when they planned to play together at a nearby park. As if everything had fallen into place, Jose began visiting Christopher's school during his breaks from work. He gave special lectures about his job as a pilot and about the airport. The kids loved hearing about Jose's adventures in the skies, and Christopher became quite popular among his classmates. I, too, was invited to teach at the school. With my teaching license in hand, I started giving lessons in Spanish. It felt fulfilling to be able to contribute in such a meaningful way to the school community. Now the three of us, Jose, Christopher, and I, are living happily in New York. Every day feels like a new adventure, and we are grateful for the life we've built together. I sat there in the grand hotel lobby, feeling utterly abandoned. I had driven for hours, convinced that staying in a famous hotel would make everything worth it. But now, as the reality sank in, I found myself alone, rejected by my own family. My in-laws and husband had reservations, but there was nothing for me. My mother-in-law had coldly told me I was no longer needed and should leave. The words echoed in my mind as I was left in the lobby, surrounded by guests who didn't even notice my suffering. The day of the parent-teacher conference arrived, and we entered the classroom with Christopher. His eyes were sparkling with anticipation, and when he saw us, he smiled brightly and waved. Surrounded by his friends, they greeted us politely. "Hello, Mr. Williams. Mrs. Williams," they said in unison. I was impressed by their good manners. Then, in walked Miss Brown, dressed in her usual flashy clothes. She looked straight at us and sneered. "You two came together? Are you both unemployed?" she asked, her voice dripping with judgment. "Shouldn't you be job hunting instead of coming here?" I was shocked that she would act this way in front of the kids. But I held my composure, not letting her words affect me. "My name is Rala. I am an only child, raised by my mother after I lost my father in a tragic accident when I was young. My mother worked tirelessly to raise me, and I grew up learning the importance of being considerate and accommodating. Now, at 31, I am married and live away from home. I met my husband, Jack, when we both worked at the same company. We were the same age and bonded over our shared values. I admired Jack for his strong opinions, his decisiveness. At the time, it was reassuring to me. But after we married, that very trait became the source of my unhappiness. Growing up, it was just my mother and me, helping each other. This upbringing taught me to avoid conflict and inconvenience others. Jack, however, had a very different approach to life. He made decisions big and small, without consulting me. He became increasingly dominant after our wedding. When we first started dating, Jack had supported my career ambitions. But after our marriage, he suddenly demanded I quit my job. When I resisted, he went around telling my in-laws, colleagues, and even my boss that I was quitting. I was congratulated by everyone, and at home, Jack pressured me to quit already. Tearfully, I complied. Then, Jack made another major decision without consulting me. We were going to move in with his parents. He told me we needed to vacate our apartment immediately, without considering my feelings. I was frustrated, but my fear of confrontation kept me silent. Slowly, my self-esteem withered away, and I felt like I was living in a world full of adversaries, following orders like a puppet. My compliance only led to more oppressive treatment. My in-laws added to the burden, making my life a daily cycle of humiliation. I couldn't stand it any longer. After a few months, I told Jack I wanted a divorce and to return to my parents. Jack mocked me for even suggesting a divorce. "Do you realize how hard it is to raise a child alone?" he sneered. "Your mom gave up her time and love to raise you, and now you want to come back, so soon after getting married? Imagine her despair." He then added, "Well, if you don't care about her suffering, I won't stop you," and walked away, leaving me standing there, unable to respond. Alone, I pondered Jack's words. My mother had started dating someone new and was considering remarriage. I knew she was finally focusing on her own happiness now that I was married. I didn't want to disrupt that, so I pushed my own misery aside. I told myself I'd be fine as long as I endured. But the treatment only worsened. Then came the suggestion of a family trip. It was my first trip since getting married, but I wasn't excited. I knew my role, to carry luggage, run errands, and be used as a servant. But I did have a small glimmer of hope that I might enjoy at least one part of the trip, perhaps the meal prepared by someone else or a long, relaxing bath at the hotel. I had been doing chores at my in-laws' house for far too long, and the thought of a break felt like a fleeting fantasy. When the day of the trip arrived, I was, of course, assigned to be the driver. It didn't bother me much on its own, but Jack and Tom, both of whom had licenses, didn't offer to take turns driving. I was stuck driving the long journey alone, with rushed breaks to accommodate their tight schedule. By the time we reached the hotel, I was exhausted. I dragged Mary's large suitcase into the luxurious hotel lobby, the elegant fragrance and soft lighting momentarily soothing me. I had hoped for a restful evening, but I knew better than to expect it. They would likely drag me out for sightseeing, disregarding my exhaustion, and use me like a porter. As I waited for Mary, who was busy taking pictures, I let out a quiet sigh, careful not to be noticed. Jack had finished the check-in process and called Mary over. Tom was standing next to him, beaming with pride about his hotel choice. I hurried over, pulling Mary's suitcase behind me, hoping to keep the peace. I just wanted the three of them to be in a good mood, for once. But when I reached the counter, Mary took the suitcase from my hands and said, "That's enough. You can go back now, but be here around 10 a.m. the day after tomorrow." Confused, I stared at Mary, but she burst out laughing, as though mocking my very existence. "Did you really think you'd be staying with us?" she sneered. "Didn't I tell you it was a family trip today?" Jack and Tom turned back, and Jack smirked. A lowly woman, raised by a single mother, surely doesn't think she'd stay in such a luxurious hotel with us, right? You should be grateful just for being allowed into the lobby. Tom clapped his hands, clearly pleased with his own cruelty. I felt my face burn with embarrassment as other guests and hotel staff watched us. I looked down, unable to bear the shame. Jack laughed mockingly, saying, "It's useless to cry. We're a family of three, so it's only natural we booked for three, right? If you wanted to stay, you should have booked your own room." They had no mercy. After ridiculing me, they told me to wait nearby and be ready to pick them up when they were ready to leave. They walked off, leaving me in the lobby, utterly defeated. Once they were out of sight, I collapsed into a nearby chair, drained of all energy. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. I couldn't keep allowing myself to be treated this way. This wasn't the life I wanted to lead anymore. I was done enduring the endless mistreatment, the humiliation. I had to find my own strength and make a change. My journey had to be about reclaiming my dignity. Even the luggage, which was only a third of Mary's, felt incredibly heavy. My arms ached as if they were carrying the weight of the world, but the emotional burden was even more exhausting. I sighed deeply, expelling all the negative emotions within me, and stood up to leave the hotel lobby. As I started walking, a staff member noticed me and came over briskly, offering me a place to rest in a cozy corner of the lobby. Gratefully, I accepted. I sank into the sofa, relieved to find a moment of respite in the midst of everything. After a while, I stood up and thanked the staff member, who then hesitantly relayed Tom's words to me. Apparently, Tom had told the staff that I would be paying for my stay. However, upon seeing our earlier interaction, the staff member suggested I discuss it with the guests and potentially combine it with the checkout payment as part of the hotel service. Feeling a mix of humiliation and exhaustion, I quietly left the hotel and made my way home. When I arrived home, I suddenly found myself overwhelmed with tears. I couldn't tell if it was sadness, frustration, or the realization that I was being openly rejected by my own family. They had belittled me for being raised in a single-parent household, and hearing it to my face was crushing. I cried, not knowing how long it would last, but at some point, I became aware of something important. I was alone now. Lonely, yes, but also free. Free from the constant criticism, free from the expectations placed on me, and free from being treated like an outsider. No matter what I did or didn't do, there was no one around to judge me. It was a strange but refreshing feeling. If I had been forced to quit my job, I could start anew. If I didn't want to live with my in-laws or husband, I could leave. If I didn't want to trouble my mother, I could live on my own. For the first time in a long while, I felt empowered. I blocked Mary's number, refusing to run away anymore. I hastily began packing, preparing to leave the house for good. 3 days later, it was the day my in-laws were supposed to check out of the hotel. However, even after the time they were supposed to contact me had passed, I received no calls. I had blocked not only Mary, but also Jack and Tom. Every now and then, I glanced at my phone, but the thought of not hearing their voices brought a sense of relief. That peace, however, was short-lived. I began receiving calls from an unknown number. Curious, I checked the caller ID and realized it was the local police station, the one overseeing the area where the hotel was located. Wondering why the police would be calling me, I answered, only to hear that my in-laws had gotten lost in the mountains and were now under police protection. They wanted me to come and pick them up. Apparently, after failing to reach me because of my block number, they had to pay their own hotel bill. Lacking a way to return home, they decided to walk to the nearest train station. But their attempts to save on taxi fare led them to take a shortcut and, inevitably, to get lost in the mountains. They were found quickly and rescued, but they were furious. They blamed me for abandoning them. As the officer relayed the situation to me with a dry smile, I couldn't help but think they should have just made their way back on their own. I resigned myself to the fact that, no matter how much they had hurt me, they were still family. So, I went to pick them up. When I met them at the station, they were seething with anger. But I was no longer intimidated. I ignored Jack's mother and thrust divorce papers into Jack's hands. His reaction was predictable. He sneered arrogantly and raised his fist, but stopped himself. Realizing we were at the police station, he knew he couldn't do anything. Instead, he tried to laugh it off, downplaying the situation. "Just kidding," he said. "Are you still angry about the other day? She really holds a grudge, you know." The officers tried to persuade me to reconsider the divorce, but I was firm. I told them I would leave them there unless Jack signed the papers. After some hesitation, Jack reluctantly signed. As we left the police station, I found myself surrounded by Jack and his family. "How dare you?" they shouted. "Not only did you not come to pick us up, but you didn't even pay for the hotel. Who do you think provided you with a life of food, clothing, and shelter?" Mary, fuming, demanded I put her suitcase in the car. I had always shrunk under their accusations before, but now I knew I didn't have to. "You just signed the divorce papers, right?" I said, voice steady. "So, we're strangers now. I have no obligation to help you." Jack lunged at me in anger, but before he could reach me, my mother intervened. When I left home, I hadn't told her why I needed to stay the night away. She had grown concerned and, upon seeing I had taken a lot of belongings with me, had asked me what was wrong. I finally told her everything. My mother scolded me for not speaking up sooner, but she also cried with happiness that I had returned. She commended my endurance and courage for choosing to divorce Jack. The in-laws, surprised by my mother's presence, openly questioned why she was there. My mother boldly replied, "I came to see the people who made my daughter suffer." Jack and his family looked down on her just as they had looked down on me. But this time, they only laughed, a hollow sound that no longer held any power over me. The in-laws, unrepentant and still full of anger, began to mockingly demand compensation. "You left us in a remote hotel, knowing we'd be in trouble. The worst part is on you," Mary sneered. "We were humiliated and suffered losses. So, we'll demand proper compensation." Her words were sharp, cutting into me. "I thought you must be a woman of low character to be abandoned by your husband, but now I see it's because of your attitude. It's your mother's fault for raising you this way. You both are responsible and will pay." I could feel my blood boil at the direct insult toward my mother. I was about to step forward, ready to confront Mary, but my mother held me back with a firm hand on my shoulder. And then, with a calm but resolute smile, she spoke to Mary. "You should remember that my husband passed away," my mother said, her voice low and steady. "But I suppose someone who expects their daughter to pick them up after such behavior wouldn't remember." There was a heavy silence. My heart pounded, but I could hear a shift in the air. Mary's expression faltered, and I could see her discomfort growing. My mother continued, her voice firm. "Sorry, I misunderstood you. My husband passed away in a traffic accident." I had never heard my mother speak like this before, and it startled me. Seeing the disbelief on their faces, I realized they were being mocked, not by me, but by my mother's quiet strength. Jack's face turned bright red, and he seemed ready to lash out, but before he could move, a man appeared on the scene. This man, calm and unbothered by the tension in the air, was my mother's new husband, the man she had married just last month. Without paying any attention to Jack or the others, my stepfather walked over and calmly said, "Now that she's divorced, she's a stranger to you. So let's go home." He urged my mother and me to get into the car. His presence shifted the dynamic entirely. The in-laws, especially Jack, were stunned, unable to comprehend what was happening. Jack had known my mother's new husband, as he was the manager of a company that placed large orders with Jack's workplace. Jack had visited his company several times a year, so the two were familiar with each other. "So, you're my daughter's husband?" Jack stammered, clearly realizing he was now facing someone who could become an enemy. My stepfather nodded, clearly recognizing Jack for what he was, a man who had been cruel to his daughter. Jack, embarrassed, tried to laugh it off, but the tension was palpable. "I'm just kidding," he mumbled, trying to smooth things over. "I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were." But my stepfather didn't give him a second glance. He simply smiled at my mother and me, urging us to get in the car. He quickly drove us away, leaving Jack and the rest of the in-laws behind, floundering in the wake of their humiliation. On the way home, my stepfather spoke to my mother, clearly unsettled by the confrontation. "That was unpleasant, wasn't it?" he remarked. Then, with a knowing look, he added, "He apologized to us, but not to our daughter." It was in that moment that I realized Jack had never apologized to me. He had never taken responsibility for his actions. Jack's desperate attempts to reconcile started shortly after. He began bombarding me with phone calls, begging for forgiveness and for a chance to renew the business relationship between his company and my father's company. He blamed me entirely for the halted business deals, insisting that I should apologize and mediate the situation. But my father had never even mentioned the business dealings to me. In fact, he had made the decision to stop the deals based on his own reasons, not because of anything related to me or Jack's behavior. Jack's persistence and desperation led him to my father's company, where he made repeated visits, begging my father's colleagues to call him to apologize. But by then, everyone could see through his manipulative actions. He had failed to consider the inconvenience his actions caused others. Jack's relentless behavior became well known among his superiors, and soon, it began to affect his work. His boss, fed up with his excessive behavior, removed him from his assignment. The damage Jack had caused to his own reputation, all because of his inability to acknowledge the truth, was irreversible. I had long since stopped responding to Jack's attempts at reconciliation. Instead, I found an appropriate moment to change my phone number, severing any remaining ties to him. After some time spent at my parents' house, I moved into an apartment nearby, wanting to give my newlywed parents some space to enjoy their new life. It was a fresh start, one where I didn't have to deal with the toxic influence of Jack or his family. I took legal action, demanding compensation from Jack for his violent behavior and mistreatment. His company had recently let him go, and I insisted on a lump sum payment for the harm he had caused. This led to Jack using his severance pay to settle the matter, which left him living a meager life, struggling to find new work. His parents, who had hoped to rely on Jack for support, found themselves in a difficult situation. They had spent their savings and were left with nothing to fall back on. Jack's fall from grace was complete. Eventually, I heard from a former colleague that the business dealings between my father's company and Jack's had resumed, but Jack, under the illusion that the damage had been undone, insisted on being reinstated at his company. But Jack's behavior had sealed his fate. His life would continue to be difficult for some time. As for me, I had moved on. Having been freed from the grip of my in-laws, I started a new job at a subsidiary of my father's company. A position had just opened up due to a retirement, and I was eager to learn and grow. Despite the challenges of adjusting to a new workplace, I felt a sense of fulfillment I had never experienced before. I was being treated as an individual, not as a daughter or a wife. I hoped to continue at this pace, leaving Jack and his family behind, and building my new life from the ground up.